Hey guys, tonight we're stepping aboard a creaky 17th century sailing ship. Not as a captain, not even as a deckhand, but as a hungry, slightly seasick sailor who's just realized there's no fridge and dinner might involve a biscuit that could break your tooth. You crouch low beneath the deck beams, ducking under rigging and hammocks, nose twitching as the pungent scent of salted meat, damp wood, and tar swirls around you. Rats scurry in the corners. Somewhere above, boots thump across the planks. And your stomach rumbles, not out of excitement, but out of worry. You're not going to like what's for lunch. Welcome to the daily diet of a 17th century sailor, where food wasn't just about survival, it was a test of endurance. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Not without a strong stomach, a sense of humor, and some very, very low expectations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love hearing how far these sleepy voyages reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to the rhythmic creaking of the hull, the groaning of ropes above, and a whistle that signals, no, not danger, a mealtime, or what passes for one. Somewhere on the orlop deck, you shuffle over to a barrel marked with strange symbols. Inside is today's treasure, a portion of salt beef, some ship's biscuit, and if you're lucky, a slosh of something wet that won't give you the runs. The basic ration for a sailor in the Royal Navy or aboard a merchant vessel typically consisted of a strict daily allotment. A pound of biscuit, a pound of meat, often salt beef or salt pork, a gallon of beer or watered-down wine, and the occasional dried pea or bean. Sounds generous, right? Until you realize that meat means leathery flesh that's been packed in salt since before your little sister was born, and the biscuit is basically wood in snack form. These weren't meals, they were tests of character. Biscuit, called hardtack, was flour and water, baked until it could outlive most buildings. Drop one on your foot and you might need a new foot. Eat one without soaking it first and you might need new teeth. Still, you gather your food and tuck into it without ceremony, because that's the deal. Eat quickly, eat quietly, and don't complain too loud or you'll be volunteered for something unpleasant, like scrubbing a latrine deck. The ship's cook doesn't so much cook as distribute. The food is prepared in batches, boiled in an iron cauldron or copper, with meals often indistinguishable from each other. Peas pudding, beef stew, and gray bean porridge all end up looking like brown paste. Sometimes they actually are brown paste. Historians still argue whether some of these recipes were deliberate or just the accidental result of boiling every leftover together. Today's ration has a peculiar smell. Not bad, actually, just ambitious. You sniff the meat and try not to think about the last guy who bit into a chunk of beef and found a nail. A real one, hammer and all. Salted meat could preserve for months, even years, but in theory. In practice, spoilage happened, and fast. Sailors learned tricks, soaking the biscuit in beer, softening it with soup, scraping the mold off with a knife. You scrape too, frowning at the black spots in the crust. Just a little extra seasoning. But oddly, you get used to it. There's a kind of rhythm to it. Rations were often divided weekly, meaning sailors received a week's worth of hardtack and meat at once. Some hoarded, others traded. A few even bartered with the cook for different cuts or bribed their way to an extra onion or spoonful of vinegar. Yes, vinegar was a delicacy. It broke the monotony, helped the digestion, and probably masked whatever uninvited guests were living in the food. Speaking of which, you eye your biscuit again. That hole, did you make that or something else did? You eat faster. And all the while, you keep your eyes on your messmates. Because while the sea might be wild, the true danger often came from right next to you. Food thieves, sly hoarders, and the occasional mutineer with an appetite for more than his share. Sailors were split into messes of 4 to 6, sharing a mess chest of utensils and storage. If someone took too much or forgot to ration fairly, it didn't end with a polite conversation. But for now, things are quiet. You sit cross-legged, cheeks full of stringy beef, trying not to crunch down on a chunk of bone. Overhead, a bell tolls. Another watch begins. Time means little out here except for food, sleep, and duty. You lean back, stomach just barely full, already dreaming of the next meal and hoping it involves something that didn't once crawl. Your jaw aches. You've barely made it through yesterday's meal and already you're facing round 2. Another biscuit, another slab of something pretending to be meat. You sigh, lean on a damp barrel, and crack open your mess tin with all the enthusiasm of someone preparing to chew on a roof tile. The biscuit, hardtack, is worse today. Stale, cracked at the corners. You tap it against the wood, and it makes a sound not unlike knocking on a coffin, and just as ominous. You're almost certain the spot in the center moved, but it might just be your sleep-deprived eyes playing tricks on you. Ship's biscuit was famously unappetizing. Just flour and water, baked hard enough to outlast storms, pests, and reason itself. It wasn't uncommon for them to be months or even years old by the time they made it aboard. And no, expiration dates weren't a thing. These biscuits were immortal in a way that would make a Twinkie jealous. You try the usual trick, dunking it into your stew. But the stew today is more like lukewarm seawater with lumps. It's technically salt meat gravy, which mostly means the cook boiled yesterday's meat again and called it sauce. You swirl the biscuit, trying to soften it, but it still crunches like gravel. Salt meat, meanwhile, was a sailor's main protein source. Beef or pork, preserved in massive barrels of salt until it took on the texture of shoe leather and the flavor of disappointment. It was delivered in chunks that were sometimes so solid they had to be hacked apart with an axe. Today's cut is pork, stringy, gristly, and so salty your lips pucker before you even taste it. You chew and chew and chew, and the meat does not yield. Historians still argue whether 17th century sailors actually enjoyed salt meat or merely tolerated it because there was no choice. Some journals describe it with affection. Briny and strong, one Dutch sailor wrote. Others describe it more accurately, like chewing a boot in a thunderstorm. And still, it was preferable to going without. You glance across the mess deck and spot a fellow sailor cleverly using his tin rug as a hammer, tenderizing his meat on a barrelhead before eating it. You nod in admiration. That's thinking ahead. Meals were supposed to be daily and consistent, but storms, ship damage, or accidents, like that time a barrel of pork went overboard mysteriously after someone sneezed too close to it, meant the rations were anything but. You remember one long stretch where all you had was biscuit, salt, and rainwater. Your dreams began to taste like roast chicken. That was the good week. Worse still were the bugs. Ship's biscuit was a haven for weevils. You could shake them out, or try. Some sailors called them sea raisins, which was adorable until you remembered they wiggled. There were debates, even then, about whether it was better to just eat the bugs for the extra protein. You tried that once. Just once. To help it all go down, sailors drank a curious mix of weak beer, diluted wine, or watered-down rum depending on the nation and the voyage. Water itself, stored in wooden casks, went stale quickly and often turned green. It picked up the taste of the barrels, musty, sour, sometimes vaguely fishy. You stopped drinking plain water 3 ports ago. The British, smartly, or desperately, turned to beer. A gallon per day, officially. Don't get too excited. It wasn't craft IPA. It was thin, low-alcohol swill, but it helped wash down the biscuit. And if you were lucky, it masked the aftertaste of mold. Today, the cook is passing around a bonus. Pea soup. You eye it with cautious optimism. Peas were dried and boiled into a thick, green sludge. It could be hearty. It could also taste like rain-soaked laundry. You slurp a spoonful and are instantly hit with the flavor of ash, salt, and regret. But it's hot at least, and you savor that warmth like a memory. One sailor at your table taps his spoon against the bowl, squinting into the depths. He reckons it's got meat in it, he says. Another raises an eyebrow. Or rat, he mutters. Everyone laughs, a tired sort of chuckle that's only half choking. You stare into your bowl. Is that hair? You eat it anyway. Sailors were expected to finish what they were given. Waste was unthinkable. If you couldn't finish your meat, someone else would, possibly while you were still holding the fork. Even if your biscuit looked like it had hosted a family of beetles, you chewed it down like a trooper. And if you complained too loudly, the bosun had a wonderful way of assigning extra duties involving buckets and other people's waste. Still, there's a strange camaraderie to it all. You, your mates, your shared misery. Food was awful, yes, but it was also ritual, shared, resented together. It became part of the rhythm of ship life. Eat, work, sleep, repeat.
and occasionally wish very hard for an apple. As you finish your biscuit with a satisfying crack, you lean back and sigh. Tomorrow might be stew again, or moldy pork, or maybe, just maybe, a surprise. I once heard about a ship where the cook made a pie out of dried apples and lard. People wept. You'd weep too. But not today. Today you have salt pork, weevils, and a gallon of tepid beer to keep you company. Life at sea. Bon appetit.
You're back on your feet, boots sticky with something you don't want to identify, as the smell of scorched fat drifts from the ship's galley. Calling it a kitchen would be generous. It's more like a blackened metal box bolted to a deck, built mostly of soot and prayers. Welcome to cooking at sea, where the menu is limited, the stove is an open flame, and the floor never stops moving. You make your way toward the galley, where a few sailors are gathered, hunched over bowls of something steaming. The cook, known only as Old Bark, squints at you from behind a curtain of sweat and smoke. He's stirring what may or may not be stew with a ladle the size of your forearm. On most 17th century ships, food was prepared in a brick or iron hearth called the caboose. On smaller ships, it might be just a firebox balanced on bricks. There was no chimney. The smoke vented out a hole or didn't. If the wind turned, you could smell lunch all the way back in the captain's cabin. That sounds charming until you realize that smelling lunch usually meant coughing on burnt biscuit dust and overboiled pork fumes. Fire aboard a wooden ship was a constant terror. One spark in the wrong direction and the whole vessel could go up like a tinderbox. So the cook's fire was strictly controlled, lit only during calm conditions and doused at the first sign of rough weather. Meaning if the sea got grumpy, dinner was canceled. You sit on a barrel and watch as Bark spoons lumpy porridge into someone's bowl. It lands with a plop and a squelch. The sailor doesn't blink. He just starts eating. You do too. Meals were simple because complexity meant danger. Imagine trying to flip pancakes on a stove that's swaying 30 degrees every few seconds. Now imagine the pancakes are boiling lard. Now imagine there are 30 hungry men yelling at you while you do it. Welcome to Bark's world. Despite this, some cooks managed miracles. With limited ingredients, mostly dried peas, salted meat, biscuit, and the occasional onion or clove of garlic, they created dishes that were at least edible and occasionally even good. Ship stew, sometimes called lopscouse or slush, could be thick, hearty, and filling if the proportions were right and no rats had recently drowned in the pot. You dip your spoon in and taste today's mystery stew. It's salty for sure, possibly pea-based. There's a faint hint of meat, but it might also be yesterday's leftover biscuit crust. You pretend not to notice the thread-like shape floating near the surface. Sailors on Dutch East India Company ships had meals based on their strict weekly schedule. One day pork, one day peas, one day fish if available. Variety was limited, but at least it was predictable. English ships sometimes added plum duff, a boiled pudding made with flour and raisins, while French sailors might get soup or lentils. But the cooking process was always the same. One large cauldron, one enormous ladle, one man shouting over the roar of wind and waves. Historians still debate how much control a ship's cook really had. Was he a true culinary master, or just the least seasick crew member with the ability to stir? Evidence points both ways. Some journals speak fondly of the cook's pot as the heart of shipboard life. Others recall it as the place where biscuits went to drown. You're jostled as a wave hits. The ladle tips and a line of stew sloshes onto the floor. A rat scampers in to investigate. No one flinches. This is normal. Of course, things got more complicated when ingredients spoiled or ran out. Substitutions were made, dried beans instead of peas, biscuit crumbs instead of flour. Once, Bark used crushed eggshells to thicken soup. You never forgave him. You eyed a fire cautiously. A single sway of the ship could send hot fat flying. That happened once last week. Jerome, the cabin boy, still has a pink scar across his knuckles. Since then, everyone's kept their distance during dinner prep. Since Bark, who seems immune to burns, cuts, and bad reviews, it's just business. Despite the conditions, there's something oddly soothing about watching the process. The clang of the ladle, the hiss of the fire, the soft gurgle of boiling liquid. In a way, the galley is the ship's beating heart. It might smell like old socks and sadness, but it's where warmth lives. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get something extra. Today, it's a dollop of what Bark calls onion mash. You can't see any onions, but it tastes different, and that's good enough. You smile, he winks, or he has something in his eye. You're not sure. The bell rings. Time's up. Cooking fire out. Galley locked.
You carry your bowl back to the deck, bracing yourself against the tilt of the ship. A breeze picks up, flapping sails and rattling ropes. The scent of dinner lingers on your clothes. Salt, smoke, and mystery meat. You settle near the rail and take one last bite as the sky darkens. It's not gourmet, but it's warm, and that's something. You lean back, stomach full, mind wandering. Maybe tomorrow the sea will be calm enough for a second helping.
You wake up groggily to the familiar creak and roll of the ship. Another morning, another meal to chase down with whatever liquid hasn't turned slimy overnight. Today, you're on hydration duty, and that means cracking open one of the water barrels down in the hold. Spoiler alert, it's going to be horrifying. You shimmy your way below deck, ducking beneath low beams and stepping over a very large, very unconcerned rat. You reach the row of water casks. The first one has a wax seal, crusted over with salt. You pry it open and dip in a ladle. The water comes out with a faint green shimmer, like soup, but without the dignity. This, unfortunately, is completely normal. On 17th century ships, water didn't stay drinkable for long. Stored in wooden barrels, it picked up every scent and spore it encountered. Wood, mold, rot, you name it. It might last a couple of weeks if sealed well and kept cool. After that, it turned. If you were lucky, it just tasted like stale rain. If you were unlucky, it came with stringy growths that waved at you in the breeze. You sniff it. Then you don't. You just drink. This is why sailors turned to stronger stuff. Beer, wine, and rum were staples, not for partying, but for survival. Beer was common on English ships, a gallon per sailor per day. It was weak, flat, and slightly sour, but still better than mystery barrel soup. The Dutch and Spanish favored watered-down wine, and if you were aboard a privateer or naval frigate, you'd likely be sipping grog, rum mixed with water and lime juice. You climb back above deck with your sloshing cup and plop down on a crate. A nearby sailor raises his tin and grins. "Cheers," he says, before gagging slightly and muttering, "God save us." Grog was the brainchild of Admiral Edward Vernon, who in 1740 ordered that rum be diluted to keep sailors from getting too drunk. That's a bit later than your current voyage, but the principle existed earlier in unofficial forms. Rum kept better than beer and made even swampy water more palatable. It was also, quite literally, the morale booster. Of course, too much morale led to incidents, fights, falls, singing at inappropriate volumes. There were strict rules about drunkenness. Break them and you'd be punished, or worse, your rations cut. That was the true terror. You take another sip. Today's mix isn't bad. A bit sharp, a little musty, but with a kick that warms the belly. You try not to think about how it might also be disinfecting your insides. Some officers tried to enforce sobriety, replacing beer with vinegar water or barley broth. It went over about as well as you'd expect. Sailors would hoard the real stuff, smuggle it in their hammocks, and trade secret flasks like gold. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of alcohol made ships safer or more dangerous. It boosted morale, helped preserve sanity on long voyages, and possibly prevented scurvy, thanks to citrus-laced grog. But it also led to more than a few men falling overboard mid-song. You watch as a fellow sailor pulls a flask from his boot and takes a long swig. He sighs. "Better than kissing the cook." You nod solemnly. One of the grossest surprises you encountered was slush, the greasy residue skimmed off boiled meat. It was saved in barrels and sometimes sold off to tallow merchants when the ship docked. But in desperate times, it could be mixed with vinegar and warm water to create a kind of broth. Sailors called it slushy soup. You called it betrayal. Still, liquids were precious. On long voyages, fresh water was more valuable than gold. Sometimes, ships would stop at islands just to refill their barrels. I remember anchoring off the coast of some craggy rock, lowering buckets into a fresh stream and tasting actual, clean water. It made me want to cry, or sing, or both. But that was weeks ago. Now it's just you, your grog, and the quiet acceptance that your beverage may be sentient. You take another sip.
Rainwater was sometimes collected from the sails and funneled into casks, but it wasn't reliable. More often, sailors prayed for storms, not for wind, but for a clean drink. When it rained, men would rush onto deck with open mouths, flasks, cups, boots, anything to catch that sweet, sweet sky nectar. As you sit sipping, the quartermaster walks by and barks orders. "Time to get moving!" You gulp the last of your rum water mix and wipe your mouth on your sleeve. Your tongue tingles. You try not to worry about it. Later, back in your hammock, you lie awake wondering what you actually drank. Was it grog? Was it pond water from 3 months ago? Was it, as one sailor claimed, cask juice with a touch of rat? You don't know. And honestly, you've stopped asking.
You're crouched low on the deck again, trying to pretend you're chewing something delicious. You're not. You're chewing something that once was food and is now more of an archaeological specimen. The salt pork is tough, the biscuit is harder, and everything tastes faintly of mildew. You take another bite and try not to think about the crunch, except there shouldn't be a crunch. You lower your biscuit and inspect it under the weak lamplight. Yep, there it is. A very small hole, a very clear wiggle. You flick the edge and a weevil rolls out like it owns the place. Congratulations, you've met your protein upgrade. Welcome to the world of maggots, mold, and men with stomachs like steel. You've made it to the part of the voyage where nothing is fresh, everything smells like regret, and the most exciting part of lunch is checking to see if something is alive inside it. It's surprisingly common. Historians note that sailors grew disturbingly tolerant of maggots, worms, beetles, and other unexpected guests in their rations. Ship's biscuit especially was a favorite for weevils, small, crunchy little insects that laid their eggs in the flour before baking, only to hatch mid-voyage. You could bang your biscuit on the table to knock them out, or just eat around them. Some just closed their eyes and crunched through. You've tried both. Neither is satisfying. A nearby sailor, teeth worn to nubs, gnaws on a biscuit and casually flicks a worm onto the deck. No one bats an eye. The cook once said, he didn't even notice the weevils anymore. Adds texture, he joked. You tried laughing, it came out hollow. The salt meat doesn't fare much better. Long months in brine make it sour, tough, and, if the barrel seal breaks, occasionally fuzzy. Mold grows in creative shapes and colors, and sometimes a bad piece of meat will stink so badly it's thrown overboard on sight. You remember one time, a barrel was open and the entire deck cleared from the smell. Even the rats wouldn't touch it. Still, meat was meat. If it wasn't green and it didn't make you vomit immediately, it was considered safe. Barely. Historians still argue whether this was due to desperation or desensitization. Either way, your stomach doesn't care. It gurgles, you eat, and you hope for the best. Some sailors tried preserving their own small catches. Fish, gulls, even flying fish that landed on deck by accident. These were salted, dried, or even smoked over the galley fire if space allowed. One daring lad once roasted a rat over an open flame behind a barrel. He was promoted to guy who cooks the weird stuff. You'd rather not talk about what that stew was the next day. But let's not forget the bread. Oh, the bread. When ship's biscuit was in short supply, makeshift loaves were made from whatever flour-like substance was left. Ground beans, old biscuit crumbs, or barley dust. If baked, they were edible. If underbaked, they became strange, squishy discs that grew mold faster than you could eat them. You once found blue fuzz in the shape of a face on your bread. It smiled at you. You didn't smile back. And still the crew ate. You too, because hunger dulls your senses, lowers your standards, and makes even moldy stew seem like a warm hug from home. To keep the worst at bay, some officers encouraged cleanliness around the mess area. Tables were wiped with seawater, utensils boiled when possible, and barrels inspected weekly. But the sea has its own opinions, and dampness soaked into everything. Food rotted from the inside out, bugs found their way in no matter how tight the seal. And sometimes, even the insects weren't enough of a deterrent. You recall one sailor, Matthew with the crooked tooth, who bit into a biscuit and spat out a sliver of metal, a nail, bent and rusted. Everyone laughed. He didn't. He spent the next week soaking his biscuit in grog until it dissolved. That became a trend. Dunk it, soak it, mash it, mix it. Anything to hide the taste and texture. Grog, stew, soup, even your own spit in desperate moments. You've seen it all. Today's innovation, biscuit porridge. You mash the hardtack into grog, stir until it's a paste, and swallow it fast. Tastes like sadness, but it goes down easy. The worst part isn't the food. It's the knowing. Knowing that every meal might carry a surprise. Knowing that halfway through a mouthful you might bite into something that wasn't there yesterday. Knowing that at any given moment your biscuit could look back at you. You try not to think about it. You chew, swallow, and stare off at the waves. Someone nearby is retching. Someone else is laughing. You just eat in silence, wondering if your stomach will protest tonight. But it probably won't. It's adapted. Somehow. You're one of them now. A weevil eater, a mold muncher, a salt meat survivor. You wipe your mouth, lean back, and sigh. Another meal down. Another day closer to fresh bread. Maybe.
You're leaning against a stack of rope coils when the familiar name of the sailor's enemy reaches your ears, scurvy. It floats through the deck like a ghost, whispered, never shouted. You glance around. Nobody looks panicked exactly, but everyone sits a little stiffer. One man coughs and covers his mouth. Another mutters something about his gums. You take a bite of biscuit and wonder if your teeth feel loose. Scurvy was the plague of long sea voyages, a slow, creeping disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. Back then, no one really knew why it happened. They just knew that after a few weeks at sea, men started bruising for no reason. Teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, and everything ached. It was terrifying. And it started, more often than not, with the food, or what the food didn't contain. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare on ships. If they were packed at all, they spoiled quickly. Cabbages turned to mush, carrots went slimy, and apples vanished in the first week like candy at a schoolyard. You remember when the cook served boiled cabbage on day 5. It was soggy, a strange color, and smelled like feet, but everyone cheered. The ship hadn't tasted anything green in days. You nearly wept into your bowl. You haven't seen a cabbage since. Some captains were better prepared. Citrus juice, especially lemon or lime, became a prized preventative. The Dutch carried barrels of lemon syrup. The British later became famous for adding lime juice to rum rations, hence the nickname limeys. But in the 17th century, understanding of scurvy was still foggy. Historians still argue whether it was scurvy, poor hygiene, or sheer boredom that killed more sailors. But one thing's for sure. The lack of fresh produce made sea life a ticking bomb for your gums. You press your tongue against your front tooth. Still solid. You relax a little. Desperate sailors tried strange remedies. They chewed tree bark. They boiled grass from island stops. One man swore that dried fish eyes had healing properties. Another swore at him when he suggested it. In the rare miracle of a harbor stop, officers bartered with locals for citrus fruit, greens, and anything resembling a vegetable. Sailors swarmed the docks, pockets full of trade trinkets, hands outstretched for a single orange. You once swapped a spoon for a slice of pineapple. Worth it. Today there's a rumor. Someone spotted a barrel of lemons below deck. You perk up instantly. A lemon could mean a feast, or at least a splash of sour joy in your rationed grog. You scamper below on your next break and search the supply area. No lemons. Just a turnip. A very old turnip. You eat it anyway. Turnips and onions lasted longer than leafy greens, so they were common on voyages. Not always beloved, but tolerated. Onion stew was occasionally celebrated as a luxury, especially if it had actual onions. Preserved fruits were rare and reserved for the officers or the sick. Dried plums, currants, or preserved lemon peels might make it aboard in small quantities. You saw a sailor bite into one once and smile like he found God. For the rest of you, scurvy prevention meant vinegar rations. You get your weekly dose in a tin cup, and it's as grim as it sounds. Sharp, sour, and barely drinkable. It cuts through your throat like regret. Still, you gulp it down, anything to keep your teeth in your head. There was a cook once who swore by a health mash, a paste made from dried herbs, pickled cabbage, and seawater. It tasted like boiled socks. It might have helped, you're not sure. He disappeared mysteriously a week later. You still suspect mutiny by flavor. You eye your crewmates now, watching for signs. Pale skin, bleeding gums, that faraway look that means something deeper than tired. Everyone tries to pretend they're fine. No one wants to be the first to fall, not from enemy fire or a storm, but from your own body slowly unraveling. Tonight, the cook adds a splash of something to the stew. You catch a whiff. Sharp? Citrusy? Maybe. You smile. You don't ask questions. You just eat. By the time you're done, the salt meat has melted into the broth, the biscuit has softened to mush, and you're licking the bowl clean, hoping the faint sourness really was a lemon and not someone's vinegar rinse water. Either way, your gums feel just a little better. And in this world, that's enough.
The night is thick with sea air, and the creak of the rigging above is like a lullaby, if lullabies came with a side of mildew and damp socks. You lie on your back, belly full of stew and imagination, thinking about what tomorrow's rations might bring. But your thoughts don't stay on food long. They wander, as they often do, toward the real heart of shipboard cuisine, the cook. You roll over and glance toward the galley. A flicker of lamplight, a silhouette moving behind a canvas flap. The cook is still up, probably muttering to himself while poking at some ancient pot. You wonder what it's like to be him, the most cursed and praised man on the ship, depending on what's in the pot. Ship's cooks weren't trained chefs. They were often injured sailors, older men, or prisoners. Anyone with a working arm and the ability to not burn everything. Some couldn't even cook before they were handed the ladle. One fellow you sailed with used to be a chimney sweep. Now he was in charge of 80 men's stomachs and morale. No pressure. You remember his name, Old Tanner. He was missing 2 fingers and wore a scarf year-round. Claimed it helped him taste better. You're still not sure if he meant the food or himself. He once served porridge that somehow tasted like tar and cloves. Nobody asked questions. The galley was no paradise. In the 17th century, it was a metal box over a fire, built in a part of the ship least likely to burn everything down. The sea tossed, the fire wobbled, the pot threatened to tip, and still the cook carried on. Sloshing stew from side to side like a soup wizard, he performed quiet miracles, or disasters, depending on the day. Today's cook, McAllister, has a limp and a bad temper, but a gift for onion gravy. He hoards herbs in his coat pockets, dried sage, a pinch of nutmeg, something he calls sea thyme, which may or may not be moss. But you respect him. He can make hardtack taste like something approaching bread if the wind is right and he's had enough rum. Historians still argue whether a ship's morale rose and fell with the cook, but among sailors, there's no debate. A good stew could hold a crew together better than any speech or flogging. And cooks had their tricks. When meat spoiled, they boiled it with vinegar and spices until it smelled passable. When water went foul, they made tea. Yes, even this early, sailors experimented with steeping leaves to mask the funk. Some made broth with dried peas and herbs, letting it sit for days like a green potion. Others dried on orange peels and dropped them into grog to freshen it. Once you found McAllister singing to his pot, claiming it needed encouragement. You didn't laugh. The man had served you edible porridge last week. That's practically wizardry. Some cooks were beloved, others feared. The bad ones hid mistakes with pepper, or worse, with no seasoning at all. A dry biscuit and gray stew combo could send a crew spiraling. You remember a voyage where 3 men nearly dueled over who stole the last sprinkle of salt. Spices, when available, were prized like gold. Black pepper, cloves, cinnamon. Most were hoarded by the officers. But sometimes a kind quartermaster slipped a bag down to the galley. You'd hear the clink of the spice box opening like a choir of angels. A single clove in your stew was reason to write home. You think about the weirdest thing you ever saw McAllister cook. Probably that time he used dried jellyfish strips in the soup. Said he picked them up in a market in Java. It was chewy, kinda tangy, and suspiciously purple. But no one died, so it went down in the logbook as a success. Sometimes he baked things, though baking might be generous. Damp flour bricks, really, cooked in a metal box jammed near the fire. He called them sea buns. I called them tooth tests. Once one cracked a man's molar, McAllister blamed the molar. And then there were the flavoring oddities. Beef broth cubes made of fat and dried marrow, seaweed paste from a broken cask. One memorable day, he flavored the stew with burnt toast crumbs and called it smoky. You still talk about that stew. You smile, remembering. A good cook turned the misery of monotony into a tolerable routine. The food might still be bland, but if it arrived warm and had texture, well, that was luxury. The cook, in many ways, was alchemist, part magician, part emotional support animal. You respected the apron, and the knife, and the look he gave you when you complained. You close your eyes now, the scent of onion and spice still clinging to your clothes. You think about what tomorrow might bring. Maybe dried peas, maybe a fish head, maybe, dare you dream, a proper roll warm from the galley. You let yourself imagine the impossible. Butter. The next morning starts as most do, damp, chilly, and flavored with the ever-present perfume of salt, tar, and half-washed humanity. You stir awake on your hammock, ears tuned to the early groans of the crew and the occasional clatter of a tin cup sliding across the deck. But there's one sound you always listen for, the hiss of water hitting hot metal. It means the cook is up, and he's boiling something. You follow your nose through the cramped quarters toward the galley. The scent is subtle at first, earthy, starchy, maybe even a little sweet? It could be breakfast porridge, or it could be boiled turnips. Honestly, on this ship, it's often hard to tell. As you approach the galley, McAllister gives you a look that suggests he either respects your curiosity or wants you to trip into the fire pit. "Breakfast'll hold itself," he mutters, ladling something pale into a wooden bowl. You take it gratefully. It's lumpy, warm, and vaguely beige. Classic. Shipboard breakfasts in the 17th century were rarely anything to celebrate. They were functional, quick, cheap, and not likely to spoil. You'd find a rotation of thin oat or pea porridge, dry biscuits dipped in warm water, or maybe a chunk of salted meat left over from the night before. On rare occasions, there might be cheese, though it would have a rind harder than most ship timbers. Still chewing your porridge, you think back to that one morning in Port Royal. The captain had used prize money to buy real bread and fresh eggs. You cried actual tears when you cracked the yolk. That breakfast remains legendary. But most mornings, they looked like this: a steaming bowl of oat glue and a prayer it didn't have weevils. Historians still debate whether the sailors' morning meals contributed to long-term health decline, or if, surprisingly, the monotony offered digestive consistency. You're not sure what your insides think, but you haven't seen anything green in days. Still, even oatmeal had variations. When molasses was on board, often stolen from cargo or acquired through trade, it transformed your bowl into something almost like dessert. A single spoonful could send the crew into a frenzy. One time, someone tried to trade his hammock spot for molasses privileges. You take another bite, this time noticing a small raisin. It might also be a burnt pea. You don't question it. On long voyages, the cook sometimes soaked stale biscuits in beer or watered-down wine to soften them, then called the mess a brewis. Served warm with a drizzle of bacon fat, if you were very lucky, it could almost be described as homey. You wouldn't serve it to your mother, but it would silence a growling stomach. Back in the galley, McAllister is already prepping the next round. He's slicing dried apples with his thumb and a paring knife. Dried fruit was rare and precious. Packed in barrels at port, they were considered a luxury and often reserved for officers. But McAllister had his ways. You once watched him bribe a quartermaster with a poem for a tin of figs. He occasionally tossed dried apples into the breakfast porridge to liven it up, though half the slices would vanish before ever hitting the pot. I suspect he eats them standing over the kettle, eyes closed like he's back on land. Another staple in the morning was beer. Not the foamy pub kind, but small beer, low alcohol, slightly sour, and just safe enough to drink instead of water. Everyone, from the cabin boy to the captain, drank it, even at breakfast, even while half asleep. You think back to a younger sailor, barely 15, sipping his beer with a grimace like a child swallowing cough syrup. There were variations depending on nationality. Dutch crews preferred their morning coffee if they had it, thin, bitter, and black as pitch.
French ships were known to include soup for breakfast, sometimes a garlicky broth poured over old bread. The English predictably leaned into oats and beer with occasional cured fish. Your ship once hosted a Portuguese cook for 3 weeks. His breakfast? Salted cod flakes with olives mashed into a paste. It wasn't popular. You remember overhearing debates about what made the best breakfast ration. One officer insisted lemon peels in the morning warded off scurvy, though he never offered his own stash. Another claimed the secret to long voyages was nothing before noon. Keeps men sharp, he'd say, sipping wine from a silver flask. The crew mostly ignored him. Your stomach rumbles again, despite having eaten. That's the thing about ship food. No matter how much you eat, it rarely feels like enough. Maybe it's the sea air, or maybe it's the effort it takes to chew stale biscuit. You glance back towards McAllister, who's now muttering to a barrel of lentils. Still no weevils, he says to no one in particular. Might be a record. You chuckle, then pause. Wait, that was a raisin.
You're halfway through a daydream about boiled eggs, runny yolks, golden and warm, when reality hits your nostrils. Something's burning. Not badly, just enough to trigger that low-level dread in every sailor's heart. You peek back toward the galley. McAllister, red-faced and squinting, is wrestling a blackened pan off the coals. The smell is unmistakable. Burnt onions. Which can only mean one thing. Stew. You sigh in relief. Not because stew is a delicacy, but because it's the closest thing to variety you're likely to get this week. And, depending on what goes in, it might actually contain texture. Stew was the great improvisation dish of any 17th century voyage. It could include anything, from salted beef and dried peas to suspicious root vegetables, shriveled herbs, or the occasional bit of hard cheese. The cook's job was to make it edible. Your job was to eat it without chewing too hard. This batch, from the smell of it, seems to involve dried lentils, pork fat, and whatever McAllister found floating near the brine barrel. A hearty base, you hope. Your last stew tasted like someone dropped a wool sock into boiling cabbage. You gather around the steaming cauldron with a few other sailors. No one says much. Conversation takes energy, and stew hour is sacred. You ladle out a portion into your wooden bowl. Thick, grayish, peppered with small brown cubes. Could be meat, could be turnip, could be both. Despite the appearance, stew was surprisingly crucial to naval survival. It combined protein, fiber, and a measure of hydration all in one pot. Plus, it used up ingredients on the verge of spoiling. Waste not, want not, or die of food poisoning in the middle of the Atlantic. Historians still argue whether the standard issue stew helped stave off illness or merely delayed the inevitable. There are accounts of ships that survived 3-month journeys on nothing but pea stew and biscuit. Others, like the doomed Batavia, saw entire crews collapse from malnutrition, despite full stew pots. You raise your bowl to your lips and sip carefully. Salty, nutty, slight hint of something floral, rosemary perhaps, or soap. You decide not to ask. There's always a chance someone seasoned the meal with seawater by mistake. You remember when Jenkins tried to impress a girl in Havana by adding a splash of ocean flavor to the captain's supper. He spent a week swagging decks with a toothbrush. Still, there's something comforting about hot stew. It's warm, filling, and unlike the hard biscuits, doesn't feel like it's threatening to break your teeth. You dip a bit of stale bread into the broth. It softens just enough to chew and soaks up the grease like a sponge. During long voyages, stews changed character depending on the supply status. Early in a journey, it might include bits of smoked ham or dried sausage. Weeks later, it devolved into boiled beans with occasional pork rind. Your ship once received a shipment of Spanish saffron, mistakenly delivered to the wrong fleet. For a glorious 5 days, the stews were golden, fragrant, almost elegant. Then the quartermaster found out. You never saw that cook again. On English vessels, standard stew meat came from salted beef or pork packed into barrels. Often submerged in brine some months, the meat turned an alarming gray. Sailors nicknamed it salt horse, and not just because of the taste. Rumors floated that unscrupulous suppliers sometimes did slip in horse meat, which was technically still protein. You once caught a glimpse of raw salt pork before it went into the pot. It looked like wet rope dipped in candle wax. And yet, after boiling for 6 hours and smothered in lentils, it wasn't half bad. You've had worse at weddings. Fringe details from ship logs paint strange pictures of seaborne gastronomy. One Dutch admiral reportedly insisted on adding cloves and dried orange peel to every stew. He claimed it soothed the men's nerves. Another account from a Portuguese merchant vessel describes fish head stew, complete with eyeballs, as a morale booster. You once tried fish stew. It smelled like regret. Most stews simmered all day on low coals in a giant cauldron slung by chains from the ceiling. It swung with the movement of the ship, splashing slightly with each wave. Sailors developed a strange sixth sense for the rhythm of the pot, ducking instinctively when it swung too far, like a pendulum full of dinner. You think back to a voyage in the Indian Ocean. Supplies were low, and for a week, the stew featured a strange grayish meat that no one could identify. Someone joked it might be seagull. Someone else joked it might be cook number 2. You tried not to think too hard about either. And still, in the worst circumstances, stew endured. It was adaptable, resilient, and, at least occasionally, tasty. You spoon up the last bite from your bowl and give it a quick sniff. Safe enough. The trick is to eat it hot. Once it cools, the grease congeals into jelly. No one wants stew jelly. Across the mess, someone's humming. An old sea shanty, probably about rum or women or both. You lean back, belly full for now. Outside, the sea slaps gently against the hull. Another day, another bowl. And you don't even miss the eggs anymore. Much.
After stew, the air below deck thickens, not just with steam, but with a sense of momentary peace. Full bellies make for sleepy sailors, and for now, no one is grumbling about weevils or complaining about the state of their socks. But as you set your bowl aside and glance toward the galley again, a different scent catches your attention. Not unpleasant exactly. Sharp, musty, oddly sweet. You know that smell. It means someone's been brave or desperate enough to crack open the cheese barrel. Yes, cheese, or at least what passes for it in the middle of the sea. Cheese was a common shipboard staple, packed tightly into cloth-wrapped wheels or sometimes brined in salt to keep mold and maggots at bay, or rather, to delay their arrival. The stuff wasn't meant to be fancy. It was hard, dry, tangy, and occasionally so aged it could probably be used as cannon shot in an emergency. But on this voyage, like most others, cheese serves a vital role. It's dense, salty, calorie-rich, and doesn't require cooking. Plus, in small amounts, it even staves off scurvy. Just enough vitamin content left in some types to count as nutritious. In theory, anyway. You remember your first bite of shipboard cheese. You'd been imagining something like your mother's soft, crumbly farmhouse cheddar. What you got instead was a rock-hard wedge the color of shoe leather and the taste of concentrated vinegar. You tried to melt it on a hot plate. It hissed like a dying rat. Historians still argue whether most naval cheeses were truly meant for eating or merely a backup ballast system. Some varieties, especially ship's cheese made in Holland, were so hard they required slicing with a saw. Others came pre-cut into bricks, wrapped in wax or cloth, and labeled with chilling accuracy. Shelf life indefinite. Today's cheese comes courtesy of McAllister again. He's hacked off a few slices with his pocket knife and is now distributing them like he's doling out gold coins. You eye your wedge cautiously. It's pale yellow, feckled with faint blue patches. Could be mold. Could be flavor. You sniff it. Sharp, but not offensive. Sailors had a few tricks for making old cheese more palatable. One involved soaking it in beer overnight to soften the rind. Another called for grating it over stew to disguise the texture. And then there was cheese toast, a delicacy requiring one flat biscuit, one wedge of cheese, and access to an open flame. Most attempts ended with either charred fingers or accidental fires. You give your cheese a tentative nibble. It crumbles slightly, dry and granular, with a funky aftertaste that lingers like a sea shanty chorus. Not bad, not great, but edible. There's a legend told among the older hands about the ghost of a ship's cook who once made a cheese pie using nothing but biscuit crumbs and boiled vinegar. They say his spirit still haunts galleys today, forever whispering, "Just one more wedge." What's certain is that cheese on board was never wasted. Even moldy pieces could be scraped, melted down, or added to porridge. Sailors swore it stuck to their ribs, which frankly was a polite way of saying it clogged your digestive system and made you forget you were starving. Some voyages, especially Dutch or French ones, brought exotic cheeses from the mainland, Roquefort, Gouda, maybe even soft goat cheese. though the latter rarely survived more than a week without turning into a sentient sponge. You once heard of a Spanish merchant ship that carried wheels of manchego so large they doubled as stools. English ships tended to carry Cheshire or ship's cheddar made to last months, if not years. Of course, by month 6, it tasted like revenge. One captain famously refused to let his men eat cheese unless they'd gone 3 days without disciplinary infractions. Sailors began bribing each other to stay in line just for a sliver of the stuff. Cheese morale, they called it. Your ship doesn't operate under such draconian rules. Here, cheese is handed out sparingly but fairly, and anyone who tries to hoard it risks a solid sock to the ribs during night shift. You notice Jenkins staring lovingly at his wedge. He's already given it a nickname. Last week it was Brianna. This week, Colby Jack III. He tucks it into a cloth pouch like it's a family heirloom. You let him have his moment. Quirky records show that cheese even made its way into sailor superstitions. Some believe that cutting a wedge on the wrong day of the week would bring storms. Others thought cheese before a sea battle was bad luck. Makes you sluggish, they said. Heavy cheese, heavy fate. Of course, others believed cheese was essential before battle. Protein, courage, and something to look forward to when you inevitably lost a limb. They can't cut off your hope if it's made of dairy. Back on deck, the sun is dropping low. The cheese has settled in your stomach like a stone in a pond. You feel heavier now, not in a bad way. Anchored. The wind's picking up a bit, ruffling the sails. Somewhere nearby, someone plays a shaky tune on a penny whistle. Your jaw aches a little for chewing, but that's fine. You know that tonight, when the stars come out and your hammock creaks gently below the mainmast, you'll be dreaming of simpler things. Fields, home, warm milk, a dinner table with soft bread and real cheese that doesn't come with blue freckles. But for now, you're grateful for what you've got, even if your dinner could double as building material.
You're still thinking about that cheese when the boatswain's whistle cuts through the dusk like a gull's cry, sharp, insistent, and entirely unwelcome. It means it's time for night duty. You haul yourself up, bones creaking like an old wooden chair, and head topside into the cooler air. The stars are just beginning to twinkle above, and the wind smells like salt and canvas. You shift your focus from your full stomach to the long stretch of hours ahead. Fortunately, there's one small mercy to make the shift bearable: the evening snack barrel. Yes, really. On longer voyages, some captains authorized a small extra ration halfway through the night. Sailors called it by many names: midnight bite, dog watch nibble, or simply the barrel. No one ever expected luxury, of course, but even a bit of preserved fruit or dried meat could brighten a miserable shift. Tonight's offering is dried peas and salted walnuts, pulled from a cloth bag and scooped into rough wooden bowls. It's a mix you've grown to tolerate. Even enjoy if you squint hard enough and pretend it's some royal delicacy. The peas are hard and slightly shriveled, but once soaked in water and warmed by a lantern, they plump into something almost pleasant. The walnuts? A rare treat if they haven't gone rancid. Historians still debate whether these late-night morsels were standard issue or generous gestures from particularly humane captains. Some records suggest the practice began as a way to prevent drunkenness, give the sailors a snack instead of grog. Others say it was just good sense. Keep the crew happy, keep the ship from falling apart. You settle near the rail and crunch a walnut thoughtfully. Not bad. A bit of bitterness, a bit of oil, and a ghost of something sweet. You almost forget you're thousands of miles from shore, with nothing but water and moonlight in every direction. Of course, not every ship was so considerate. Many crews we left to chew on stale hardtack or suck on leather scraps soaked in brine to keep their jaws busy. There's one infamous account from a Dutch voyage where the snack was boiled rat tail, cooked soft and served with vinegar. That's the kind of story you hope is exaggerated, but probably isn't. You hear a snore from somewhere up the rigging. Jenkins again. He's dozed off during watch, hugging his coat like it owes him money. You consider tossing a pea at him, but think better of it. Let the man dream. Back in your bowl, there's one last shriveled pea. You pop it in your mouth and let your eyes drift across the horizon. Somewhere, the moon is rising, a glowing coin in the ink-blue sky. The lanterns swing gently above you, and the sails flap with soft, rhythmic sighs. You feel strangely content. The salt on your lips, the crunch in your teeth, the quiet camaraderie of a crew half asleep, half dreaming, and all pretending this life is normal. You glance toward the galley hatch and notice something strange, a faint flicker of light that isn't fire. Could it be? No, surely not. You edge closer and catch the unmistakable scent of something sweet. Molasses. It turns out the cook's assistant, young Billy from Liverpool, has decided to toast some biscuit crumbs in a pan with lard and molasses, creating what he boldly calls sea pudding. It's barely more than crunchy sugar lumps, but to your exhausted brain, it smells like heaven. Billy grins when he sees you peering in. Want a pinch? He whispers, holding out a spoon. You don't hesitate. One taste, and the world softens. The bitterness fades. Even your sore feet stop complaining. It's amazing what sugar and desperation can do. Sweet treats were rare but highly coveted at sea. Sugar, molasses, and dried fruits were carefully rationed, often saved for sick crew members or used to lure back anyone threatening to jump ship. But on good days, birthdays, smooth weather, or especially generous captains, sailors might find themselves treated to duff, a kind of boiled raisin pudding, or even flapjacks made from leftover biscuit crumbs fried in pork fat. Most of the time, though, sugar was more valuable as barter. A spoonful of molasses could buy you a week's worth of dish duty off. A lump of raw sugar? That might earn you a hammock near the mast. Less sway, more sleep. Still, even the tiniest treat could lift morale. There's a documented case from an English whaler in 1683 where the entire crew wept when the cook unveiled a fig cake on Christmas morning. The man used all the ship's flour, a handful of raisins, and boiled it in his own hat. No one cared. They called it the best cake they'd ever eaten. And now here you are, licking sticky molasses off a wooden spoon and feeling like you've won the lottery. The wind shifts slightly and the stars wink brighter. You lean back against the warm planks of the galley wall and listen to the hum of the ship. The groaning timbers, the distant creak of rigging, the faint gurgle of water slapping the hull. Your hands are sticky, your belly is full, and you're covered in salt and biscuit dust. And somehow, all of it feels okay.
The bell rings again, signaling the end of your shift, and you shuffle below deck with the rest of the night crew, faces drawn, limbs heavy. Your hammock calls like a siren. But as you swing yourself in and try to settle, your stomach reminds you of something important. Tomorrow morning, you'll eat again. And the first meal of the day? Well, breakfast aboard a 17th century sailing vessel is a loose term. You won't be greeted by eggs Benedict or flaky croissants. You won't even get a hot cup of anything unless the cook's in an unusually generous mood. Instead, breakfast is often the same thing you had last night, and the night before that. Hardtack, cheese if there's any left, and maybe, just maybe, a ladle of thin beer or watered-down wine. Tea and coffee are luxuries for port life. At sea, warmth is optional, but chewing is not. The hardtack makes its inevitable return. You bite into it like a woodpecker going after a stubborn tree. It splinters with a dry crunch that echoes down your spine. A sip of small beer, the weak, watery brew rationed daily, helps soften the experience. Barely. Still, there's comfort in routine. The dull rhythm of bite, sip, sigh. You sit on a barrel beside a snoring messmate and pretend it tastes better than it does. Historians argue over whether this kind of breakfast was meant to fuel the crew or simply shut them up. Some suggest it was intentionally bland to avoid upsetting seasick stomachs or tempting picky appetites. Others believe it was the best they could do given what they had: non-perishable, dense, and cheap. But even among sailors, there was variation. Ships carrying spices, for example, often smuggled a pinch or two into breakfast. Imagine oatmeal laced with stolen cinnamon, or cheese kissed with a sprinkle of nutmeg. Exotic cargo meant exotic scraps. You remember one sailor, Piers from Cornwall, who swore he could make anything taste like pudding with enough clove. Once, he even spiced up a bowl of boiled seaweed and tricked 3 other crewmen into eating it. They hated him. They also asked for seconds. Not everyone had such creative flair.
On French vessels, breakfast might involve a dry biscuit dipped in brandy. Spanish crews sometimes began their day with salted anchovies or chickpea mash, depending on the port they last visited. And on Dutch ships, pickled herring. Always pickled herring. You try not to think about the smell. Back on your ship, the morning meal is mercifully brief. There is not much to savor, and the cook doesn't linger. You pass your wooden bowl back to the scullery lad and stretch your arms until your joints pop. Then, the real work begins. Today, it's your turn to clean the hold. That means wading through barrels, checking for signs of spoilage, and making sure no rats have claimed territory. It's damp, it's dark, it smells like moldy onions and sweat-soaked rope, but it's also where the food lives. Down here, you get to see the bones of the ship's pantry, the salted pork stacked like bricks, the barrels of dried peas sealed with wax, the sacks of oats and biscuit flour tucked away behind ropes and spare canvas, each one labeled, crudely, with charcoal scribbles, flesh, grains, fruit. The handwriting varies and some labels are missing altogether. It's a treasure hunt you didn't ask for. You tap on a barrel and listen. A hollow echo means it's nearly empty. A dull thud, full of goodness. Or weevils. You crack the lid to check. Not weevils, thankfully. Just dried apples. Tough as leather, but still vaguely apple-shaped. There's something calming about it all. The quiet rhythm of checking, stacking, noting. You pause to slice off a bit of dried meat and gnaw on it absently. It's salty, chewy, and somehow reassuring. That's the strange truth of shipboard life. You grow attached to even the blandest meals. A slab of bacon becomes a beacon. A piece of biscuit, a small miracle. And sometimes, just sometimes, you find surprises. Tucked behind an old coil of rope, you spot a tiny glass jar sealed with wax. You pop it open and sniff. Honey. Actual honey. You glance around like you've discovered buried treasure, which, in a way, you have. Honey was a rare but prized commodity at sea, not just for flavor, but for its medicinal uses. It soothed sore throats, sealed small wounds, and even served as a kind of antiseptic. Sailors called it liquid gold, and they weren't wrong. You hide the jar in your coat. Maybe you'll share it with Jenkins later. Or maybe not. Either way, your shift just got a little sweeter. As you finish checking the last barrel, your mind wanders to stories you've heard. Tales of ships where the cook hoarded spices, or where someone brewed coffee in secret using beans meant for trade. One captain supposedly kept a stash of chocolate hidden in his quarters, sipping it at night while the crew gnawed on biscuit ends. There's always a hierarchy when it comes to shipboard meals. Officers eat better. Cooks get first pick. The rest, they make do. But now and then, someone breaks the rules, quietly, kindly, and shares something special. You close the hatch, wipe your hands on your trousers, and head back up into the light. Above deck, the sun's rising. The sails billow gently, the sky a soft wash of gold. You breathe in the fresh air, still tinged with salt and wood smoke. Your stomach is calm, your fingers are sticky from honey, and your mind is drifting, already halfway to sleep, even though it's the beginning of the day.
The midday sun crawls higher now, leaning heavily onto the deck as you swat lazily at flies that shouldn't be this far from shore. There's a lull in the wind. The ship rocks gently, not enough to bother your stomach, but just enough to make everything feel suspended, like time itself has decided to nap. And now it's time for dinner. In 17th century sailor terms, dinner is the main meal of the day, served just after noon. And much like breakfast, it's dictated less by appetite and more by habit, supply, and the whim of whatever sea gods are keeping the cook's cauldron from boiling over. Today you can smell something cooking, or at least heating. It wafts from the galley in muted puffs, smoke, brine, and the unmistakable note of onions long past their prime.
You pass Jenkins near the companionway and he gives you a sleepy nod. "They're doing the salt beef again," he mutters, "with peas this time, or what's left of 'em." You grin. A familiar combination, and somehow comforting despite the repetition. Salt beef and peas porridge, a duo as timeless as the sea itself. Salt beef is a staple, huge slabs of cow flesh preserved in brine and packed into barrels. When fresh, it's tough and sinewy. When aged, it's tougher and, well, more aromatic. The brining process could last months, and by the time you're digging into a piece mid-voyage, it might be older than some of the newer deckhands. Peas porridge, on the other hand, is essentially a mash of yellow split peas boiled to the consistency of wallpaper paste. It doesn't sound appetizing, and it usually isn't, but it fills the belly. And on days when the cook's feeling generous, it might even be flavored with pork fat or scraps of onion. Those are the good days. You line up with your wooden bowl and wait your turn, inhaling the scene around you. Bare feet shuffle against warped planks, the sun presses down, someone's humming a tune in the galley, off-key but earnest. When your bowl is filled, it's a gloppy mountain of porridge topped with a grayish chunk of beef. You jab at the meat with your spoon. It resists. Eventually you give in and bite. The flavor, salty, very salty, and a bit like old rope, if old rope were edible. But the porridge is soft and warm, and together they make a meal that holds you upright until the next bell. Historians still argue whether the monotonous diet of the air was a survival tactic or simply logistical laziness. Some believe the sameness kept sailors grounded, a predictable island in a chaotic sea. Others argue it dulled the senses, made men sluggish, slow to mutiny. After all, it's hard to start a revolution when your mouth's glued shut with peas mush. But the real key to sailor survival wasn't just what they ate, it was how they used what they had. You learn tricks, like soaking salt beef in seawater to leach out excess salt, or burying onions in flour to keep them from rotting, or turning yesterday's biscuit crumbs into dumplings. With enough time and creativity, even the worst rations can become slightly less bad. You remember old Diego, the Spanish sailor, who used to scrape the char off burnt hardtack and add it to stew as seasoning. He claimed it tasted like nutmeg. It didn't. But no one argued because somehow that stew always tasted better when he made it. Across the ship, other men eat in pairs, in silence, or while muttering about how their wives make better soup. One lad carefully removes the weevils from his biscuit, placing them delicately on the rail like he's setting them free. Another just bites through them, unbothered. There's a camaraderie in the suffering. You're all chewing the same mush, drinking the same stale water, missing the same solid land. On days when the cook has extra fat or bone scraps, he might boil up something fancy, sea pie, a layered dish of whatever's left, salt meat, hard biscuit, dried fruit, and maybe some onions, baked into a weird, dense stack of conflicting textures. The first time you had it, you laughed. The second time, you asked for more. One officer aboard tells stories of Royal Navy dinners, meals with boiled lobsters, roasted game birds, even puddings. But that's fantasy for common deckhands. For you, the dream is a warm biscuit and meat without gristle. Still, once in a while, a merchant vessel gets lucky. If the ship stops at a friendly port, you might get a fresh meal. Bread still soft. Fish that hasn't been salted into submission. Maybe even fruit. Fresh food is like treasure. Sailors would trade buttons, boots, or favors for an apple. I once heard of a man offering to swab decks for a week in exchange for a single onion. Not for flavor, but for scurvy prevention. Scurvy, of course, is the ever-present boogeyman of sea life. Caused by vitamin C deficiency, it turns your gums to jelly, makes your teeth fall out, and slowly kills you. The signs are subtle at first: fatigue, bleeding gums, but every sailor knows to fear it. The solution? Citrus. But lemons and oranges spoil fast. So unless your captain is unusually forward-thinking, or your ship very well funded, prevention is more wishful thinking than strategy. Tonight, though, you're content. The porridge is warm, the salt beef is manageable, and you saved a pinch of the honey from earlier to smear on your biscuit. You close your eyes, letting the salty breeze mix with the savory smells of the galley. Someone starts telling a tale about a ghost ship made entirely of cheese. You chuckle, not because it's funny, but because everything's funny when you're full and half asleep. The sun dips lower, your stomach is quiet, your limbs are heavy, and dinner, for all its flaws, has done its job.
As the light fades into a soft amber glow, the ship eases into the gentle rhythm of early evening. The shadows stretch, the wind calms, and a hush falls across the deck that's less silence and more an exhale from the day. Your belly is still warm with salt beef and peas, and though you're not exactly satisfied, you're full. And at sea, full as a gift. Now it's time for supper. Yes, another meal, but don't get too excited. Supper off 17th century ship isn't a grand affair. It's a humble, final nibble meant to tide you over until dawn. Often cold, sometimes skipped altogether if supplies are low or the sea is rough. But tonight, things are calm, and that means something small is coming your way. You crouch near the galley hatch, watching the cook's assistant, barefoot, soot-smeared, probably 12, toss handfuls of dry biscuit into wooden bowls. No garnish, no sauce, just the hard, cracked relics you've come to accept as bread. Maybe, if you're lucky, they've been briefly dipped in warm water or ale. Maybe. Supper isn't really about nourishment. It's about ritual. Eating something before sleep is comforting. It creates a sense of normalcy in a world where nothing else stays still. And so you take your ration, sit cross-legged near the mast, and begin the slow task of chewing. It's less like eating and more like negotiation. You tap the side of the biscuit, listening for the telltale hollow knock. That's where the weevils have burrowed. You snap the edge, find the softest bit, and gnaw carefully. The taste is flat, dry, and faintly musty, like chewing on an old bookshelf. But in the fading twilight, it feels almost soothing. Historians still argue whether these late meals were a practical necessity or merely psychological comfort. After all, there's little energy in a few ounces of dry biscuit. But some claim that this simple act, a few bites before bed, helped sailors sleep more soundly. The repetition, the quiet, the full mouth, like a bedtime story through food. Tonight's supper includes something rare, a sliver of cheese. You're shocked. Cheese doesn't travel well, not for this long. It must have been buried deep in a captain's crate or smuggled from a recent port. It's waxy, sharp, and smells faintly of boot leather, but it melts on your tongue, and for a fleeting moment, you feel rich. Next to you, Jenkins raises his biscuit and mutters, "To the rats that didn't get it first." It's a toast you've heard before. The sky is now streaked with stars. You lean back, cradle your bowl, and stare upward. The Milky Way spills across the black canvas, shimmering like spilled flour in the night. Somewhere, far below your feet, the deep sea turns silently in the dark. Meals on a ship are never private. You eat in a crowd, elbow to elbow with men who snore louder than cannons and haven't bathed since last port. But somehow, at night, it feels intimate, like everyone's finally too tired to pretend. You can hear soft murmurs, little jokes, quiet laughter, a man humming a lullaby he doesn't realize he's humming. It's not peace exactly, but something like it. Occasionally, the night meal includes pickled vegetables. Not often, not fresh, usually onions or cabbage floating in vinegar. But their sharpness cuts through the fatigue like a splash of cold water. One man swears pickled onions cure seasickness. Another claims they attract rats. Nobody knows for sure. And speaking of rats, they're always around. During supper, you'll hear them skittering behind barrels or scratching in the walls. Some ships kept cats, though most didn't survive long. Still, you eat anyway. You get used to the company. You nibble the last corner of your biscuit, sucking it slowly until it dissolves. Then, as is your habit, you sniff your bowl to see if it still holds any hint of flavor. It doesn't, but the action feels necessary. Nearby, someone's telling the story of a man who once fell asleep in the rigging and woke up in a different port. Another sailor insists he saw sea cows off the coast of Africa and that they weep at night. Nobody believes him, but nobody really minds. The moon is up now, round and silvery, casting a pale sheen across the sails. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the creak of rope and wood, the rhythmic slap of water against the hull. There's something oddly sacred about this meal, not because it's good, but because it's shared. Every man on board is chewing the same stale biscuit, wishing it were cake, and pretending not to notice the weevil legs. You think back to home, to a warm hearth, soft bread, and maybe a stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. You smile. Those memories taste sweeter than any cheese. You stretch, arms overhead, bones clicking softly. The deck is cool under your legs, supper is finished, your bowl is clean, or as clean as it gets, and you feel grounded. As night deepens,
The galley shutters are closed. The cook's assistant curls up in a corner, already asleep. The ship continues on its slow journey, stars spinning gently overhead. And all across the deck, sailors settle into makeshift beds, stomachs lined with porridge and beef and biscuit crumbs. You too, lie back, one arm under your head, eyes half closed. Supper, however simple, has done its work.
Your body's heavy now, settled low into the curve of the deck like it belongs there. Salt air licks gently at your cheeks, and the occasional creak of the hull becomes a lullaby all its own. You've made it through another day at sea. And, as strange as it sounds, you've come to find a certain rhythm to it, a lulling, almost hypnotic pattern to the hunger, the chores, the endless ocean. But before dreams fully take you, there's one last thing you can't help but think about: tomorrow's breakfast. What does a 17th century sailor eat when the sun returns? Well, you've already had it. Remember that lump of oat porridge? If supplies are decent, it'll be back on the menu. Maybe, just maybe, a splash of treacle or molasses to cut the blandness, but most days, just a thick, gray clump. Warm if you're lucky, lumpy always. You know it by smell before you even open your eyes. Damp wood, burnt oats, and a faint tang of brine. A scent that says you're still on the ship, but there's comfort in the consistency. Like the sea, breakfast never surprises you. Sometimes it's leftovers from yesterday's dinner, scraped together and reheated in the cook's battered cauldron. You might get a scoop of beans, maybe a thin broth if the ship's stocked with dried peas or lentils. No eggs, no bacon, no toast. Forget fruit. A banana on board would be witchcraft. Historians still argue whether sailors received enough calories overall. Official records suggest they did, but those records don't account for sportilage, theft, or a weevil population large enough to warrant its own navy. Diaries from the time often hinted gnawing hunger. One sailor wrote, "I eat, but I am never full." Another joked that his boots looked better with mustard. Yet somehow, you adapt. You lower your standards. You start to crave the familiar over the flavorful. And so breakfast becomes more than food. It's a kind of marker, proof that the day is beginning again, that the ship is still afloat, that you're still you. There are quirks to it, though. For instance, some captains allowed ship's beer with breakfast. Weak, flat, barely alcoholic, but safer than water. It washes down dry biscuit better than seawater, at least. You sip it from a tin cup that's been used for everything from stew to shaving. It tastes metallic, like history and regret. If the ship has a good cook, rare but not impossible, you might get something fried in fat, a flapjack of sorts made from crushed biscuit, a bit of molasses, maybe some dried fruit. It's hard, sticky, and vaguely sweet. You pretend it's a pastry. You chew it for a full 10 minutes. And the strange part, you start to look forward to it. Even that dry biscuit, when crumbled into your porridge, becomes something new. You invent combinations. You trade rations with your bunkmate. You hoard a love of cheese for 3 days just to sprinkle it over hot peas. Culinary creativity, born of desperation. Breakfast is also when you hear the ship's gossip. Who snored, who vomited overboard, who saw something odd in the water. Usually a whale, sometimes a mermaid, occasionally a floating shoe. Stories are shared over bowls and spoons and mugs that rattle with every wave. You've developed a whole set of rituals now. You eat on the same spot near the stern where the morning sun warms the boards. You lean against the barrel that smells like tar and oranges. You watch the same man, Garrick with the big nose and missing tooth, slurp his porridge like it owes him money. Familiarity. It's your anchor. Today, as you sip your ale and scrape the bottom of your bowl, someone offers a bit of dried apple. It's leathery and brown, like old parchment, but the taste, sour, sweet, unexpected, jolts you awake more than any sunrise. You chew slowly, savoring it like a nobleman with candied figs. This is treasure. This is joy. Historians speculate that small luxuries like this, bits of dried fruit,
The odd spoonful of jam, a pinch of nutmeg, were often kept hidden in oilskin pouches, only shared when morale needed saving. They weren't part of the standard ration, but they were part of sailor life all the same. You tuck into the last of your meal. The ship groans under your feet. A gull cries out overhead, proof that land might not be far. Or perhaps it's just teasing. You glance around at your crewmates, bleary-eyed and quiet. Everyone's chewing, everyone's awake. And somehow, that's enough. The cook's bell clangs, time to stow the bowls and get to work. But for a moment, you linger. You let the taste of oats and salt and mystery linger in your mouth. You stretch your legs, you breathe deep. Because at sea, even a bad breakfast is still a beginning. And now, with your belly full of porridge, of biscuit, of imagination, you ease back into the gentle sway of the ship, real or imagined. The wind outside hums like a lullaby, the kind sailors might have sung under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, their minds drifting far from the scent of salt and tar. You've sailed far tonight, through barrels of pickled mystery meats and crates of dubious cheese, through sour beer and sweet apples, broken biscuits and endless waves. You've stood shoulder to shoulder with men you'll never meet, shared their meals, their grumbles, their rituals. So let the ship rock you now. Let the groan of the hull and the flap of canvas lull you into that quiet space just before sleep, where every creak feels familiar, where time moves slowly and every thought softens around the edges. Out there, beyond the dark, the sea keeps rolling. The stars turn overhead. Somewhere, a ship's cook stirs his pot, muttering about weevils and spoons. Somewhere, a sailor stretches in his hammock, tucking a scrap of dried fruit into his sock for tomorrow. And here, where you are, there is only stillness. So let go. There's no need to trim sails or swab decks now. The day's labor is long behind you. The night has folded in gently, like a soft blanket of fog. And if your dreams drift toward tall ships and rough hands and the taste of molasses on your tongue, well, you've earned them. Sleep easy, sailor. Tomorrow waits. But tonight, you rest.